Check out this JavaScript code. I have created a call to the function sum with the two arguments 1 and 2. And then after this call has been created, I have created the function sum. So function sum has two parameters a and b, and it simply just prints the sum of a and b. What do you expect will happen if I run this code? So this code runs perfectly fine. What if I do this instead? So now I've changed how I've created the function sum. Instead of doing a function declaration using the function keyword, now I have created a constant called sum and assigned it an arrow function, does the same as before. Okay, so now I have this reference error that says that I cannot access sum before it is initialized. What about this? What if instead of using const, what if I use var? Now in this case, I still have an error, but the error is a type error that says that sum is not a function. If you've watched the previous videos in this series, then you'll have at least some idea about what's going on. If you haven't watched them, go do right now. I've left a link to the playlist in the description box below. In this video, we are going to learn about hoisting in JavaScript functions. We've already learned about hoisting in var declarations and about the temporal dead zone in const and let variables. Let's go back to the first code example. Here, you are able to call this sum function before it is declared. And you're not only able to access the keyword sum, you're also able to access the function body or the definition of this function. If you haven't guessed it yet, then yes, this is hoisting. Particularly, this may also be referred to as value hoisting in JavaScript. So this is a little bit different than the hoisting in var. In value hoisting, you're able to use a variable's name as well as its definition before it is actually defined. So in this case, the JavaScript interpreter hoists the entire function before any declaration to the top of the current scope. So the previous code example is equivalent to this code. So here the function sum has been hoisted towards the top of the current scope. So in this case, the global scope. This is known as value hoisting. So this term is again not an official term, but a lot of developers may refer to it as value hoisting to differentiate it from the hoisting that happens in var, which is declaration hoisting. Let's take an example of declaration hoisting here. So if I do console.log sum, and on the next line, if I declare the var variable called var sum equals to 0. Now in this case, instead of printing 0, it prints undefined. That's because in declaration hoisting, only the declaration is hoisted, not the value. So it will behave as if var sum was declared at the top of its current scope. Then you do console.log sum. So since sum has not been initialized with a value yet, that's why it prints undefined. And then on the next line, sum actually gets initialized with the value 0. Before moving forward to function hoisting, let's do a quick recap of const and let variables as well. So if you try to access a const or a let variable before it is declared in its actual scope, then that leads to a temporal dead zone error saying that you cannot access a let or const variable before it is actually initialized. So here's a quick note on the term hoisting. So the term hoisting is not an official term described in the ECMAScript specification. The ECMAScript specification only describes 4 hoistable declarations. So these hoistable declarations include only function declarations and function generators, but it does not include the var declarations. When people refer to hoisting in functions, they're referring to the value hoisting behavior. When people refer to hoisting in var variables, they're referring to the declaration hoisting behavior. Let and const variables may be referred to as non-hoisted, or sometimes people may say that they are hoisted, but they are hoisted in the temporal dead zone. Now let's talk about what do we mean when we say a function declaration. So when you create a function using the function keyword like this, so function, name of the function, then the parameters, and then the function body within curly braces, this is known as a function definition or a function declaration or a function statement. Whereas when you say a function expression, the function expression is different from a function definition. We created a function expression using the const and var keywords in the beginning of this video. So when we do something like this, const sum equals to an arrow function, let sum equals to an arrow function, or var sum equals to an arrow function, these are function expressions. These expressions have been used as a value that is then assigned to these let, const, and var variables. Instead of arrow functions, you could also use the anonymous function syntax here. This is still a function expression. So the reason why I am differentiating between a function declaration and a function expression is because hoisting behaves differently in function expression and in function declaration. So the value hoisting behavior only works in function definitions. It does not work on function expressions. Function expressions are basically just expressions. So if you do something like var sum equals to 0 or var sum equals to a function, this is just a value that has been assigned to a var variable. Now in this case, since it's a var variable, the hoisting that will happen is declaration hoisting. The rules of hoisting of var will be applied to this var variable, which holds the value of a function instead. That's why when you try to call sum before the function expression that has been assigned to a var, now in this case, declaration hoisting will happen. So the declaration of the keyword sum will be moved to the top of its current scope. And then after that, when you try to call sum as a function, it says that you cannot call sum as a function because sum is undefined. It is uninitialized at this point. That's why this leads to a type error because you're trying to call undefined as a function. Similarly, when you try to create a function expression using let or const keyword, now the rules of let and const keywords will apply here. Now this keyword sum will enter into a temporal dead zone. That's why the error that you get when you try to access sum before it is declared is a reference error, which says that you cannot access sum before it is initialized. Okay, now I hope that you understand the hoisting that happens in functions and how it is different from the hoisting that happens in var variables. Now let's talk about the scope of functions. So the scope of function declarations actually is a mix between let and var variables. So let's go through these rules one by one. In the strict mode, which is when you use the use strict directive at the top of your JavaScript programs, then function declarations behave like let. So since let and const variables are scoped to the block, in the strict mode, function declarations are also scoped to the block. So if you declare a function within a block and then try to access it outside of the block, for example, if you try to do something like this, so I have an if block here and inside of it, I've created a function called foo. If I try to access foo outside of this function, then this results in a reference error. Note that we are in the strict mode because I've used the use strict directive at the top of this file. So this function foo is block scoped to this if block. However, it will be hoisted differently to the let and const variables. So remember, functions display value hoisting at the top of its current scope. So in this case, the scope of this function is this if block. So this function entirely will be hoisted to the top of its current scope. That's why you're able to access this function, execute this function, call this function anywhere inside of this block. But if you go outside of this block, now you have stepped outside of the scope of the function. That's why it results in an error. Whereas in the non-strict mode, if you remove this use strict directive, in this case, function declarations start behaving strangely. So they behave differently in different browsers. That's why it's advised to only declare functions inside of blocks when you are in the strict mode. Otherwise, avoid declaring functions inside of blocks. Now let's talk about redeclaring functions. The function declarations can be redeclared in the same scope, depends on what scope it's contained in. So at the top level of a script, which is outside of any blocks, outside of any functions, you can redeclare function declarations. So you could do something like this. You could create a function called foo, and then you could again define a function called foo, and this is perfectly valid in JavaScript. And you can also redeclare this keyword as a var instead, and again, this is perfectly valid. However, you cannot redeclare this function foo with a let or const variable. Now this results in an error. So the identify foo has already been declared. So you cannot do let foo or const foo in this situation. You could do something like this: function sum a, b, and then print console.log a plus b. And then you can again redeclare this function with different arguments and a different function definition. This is perfectly fine. You could also redeclare this keyword sum as a var variable instead. However, you cannot redeclare it as a let, const, or a class keyword. Now this let sum results in an error saying that this sum identifier has already been declared. Now let's see what happens when you redeclare an identifier as a function, as a var. Let's see how it will behave. So I have a function called sum which accepts two parameters a, b. Then I have created var sum equals to 10, and then I've created function sum. Again, now this sum takes three parameters or three arguments and prints a plus b plus c. If you try to print console.log sum, what would be the value of sum? Will it refer to this first function, or will it refer to this var variable and print 10, or will this print this second function here? So when function declarations are redeclared by var, the var declarations initializer always overrides all of the functions regardless of its position. So what this means is no matter how many times you redeclare this function with the function keyword, this var declaration is always going to override the value of this sum identifiers irrespective of its position. So even if it is the first line here, the identifier sum will still print 10. So when you do console.log sum, it prints 10. So this initializer 10 overrides both of these functions. Why is that? Because of how hoisting works. So this code will be equivalent to this. So both of these functions will be hoisted towards the top of the current scope. The var declaration will also be hoisted to the top of its current scope, but the initialization will happen later on in the code. So since these functions have been hoisted and their values have also been hoisted, so even if this var sum appears after, then obviously in this case it will still print 10. If you add another var sum equals to 20, now in this case the sum that comes later on will override the value of the previous var itself. So it will now print 20. So one thing to keep in mind here is that you should anyways avoid redeclaring the same variable within the same scope, or else it is going to lead to confusion. So avoid duplicate declarations for a function for a var keyword within the same scope. Shadowing is fine if done correctly. And anyways, instead of using var, you should always use let and const instead. If you want to learn more about the redeclaration rules of the function keyword, then I've left a link to the MDN documentation in the description box below. If you want to see how it behaves when a function is redeclared within a block, within a module, you can check it out. Before we end this video, I want you to answer this question: what will be the output of this code? So I've created a call to this function called greet, and I've passed the argument John to this function. Then I have created another function using the function expression syntax. So var greet equals to this arrow function, which accepts name and prints good day, comma name. And then I've created a function definition after this, and I've done function greet, which again accepts the same parameter. And instead of printing good day, it now prints hello, comma name. And finally, I've again done greet John. So what will be the output in this case?